Forward. Hello, and welcome back to the third part of my video series on Final Fantasy Tactics. For those of you who haven't watched them, the first video examines the uprising of the Corpse Brigade, and the second video explores the structure and function of the Church of Glabados. These videos are organized thematically, not sequentially, so they can be viewed in any order. This video will focus on the underlying political structure of the Kingdom of Ivalice and the society and culture of the ruling houses. My hope is that by examining the depiction of the nobility in Final Fantasy Tactics, we may inform our own understanding of the popular representation of the feudal state and critically examine how the developers incorporate and undermine long-held assumptions about the Middle Ages. As always, I will do my best to include enough narrative material so that you won't be missing out too much if you haven't played Final Fantasy Tactics. A reminder that this video will contain spoilers for the entire game, so if you want to experience the majesty of the game for yourself, I always recommend going in blind. Oh, and one more thing. I will be relying on the script from the War of the Lions version of the game, as it presents a more faithful adaptation from the original Japanese. With the preamble complete, welcome back to the struggle, comrades. The Aristocrats. To start off, I'd like to discuss the ruling dynasty of Ivalice, the Atkachas. Now, I know the rehashing of character descriptions can be a bit tedious, but trust me, it's part of the game which isn't explained particularly well without doing a little bit of digging, so allow me to do the digging for you. King Undoria Atkacha III is the reigning monarch during Chapter 1, but he is in poor health and dies not long after the start of Chapter 2. He is described as being a relatively sickly individual, ill-suited to govern and generally seen as a poor replacement for his predecessor, King Dinamda IV. Queen Luviria Atkacha, wife of the late Undoria III, had maintained a de facto rule of Ivalice in her husband's stead, owing to his poor constitution. She gave birth to 3 sons in total, but only one survived beyond infancy. She is also the sister of Duke Larg, and so, despite her never appearing in the narrative of the game, she is one of the primary antagonists of the War of the Lions, who pushes for her son, Crown Prince Ornus, to be made king. Crown Prince Ornus, the infant son of the late Undoria III, owing to the medieval policy of primogeniture, stands to succeed his father to the throne. However, because of his age, the High Council of Ivalice must appoint a regent to rule in his stead, effectively making them the de facto ruler of the kingdom. Princess Ovilia Atkacha is the daughter of the former king, Dinamda IV, and half-sister to King Undoria III. Owing to her relative youth, she was adopted by her half-brother and was set to be next in line to rule Ivalice, until the unexpected birth of the crown prince. She was then taken into the care of Duke Gultana. King Dinadma IV, successor to King Dinadma II, the king who began the 50 Years' War, was a stalwart warrior king who successfully led the much smaller Ivalicen forces against the Undorian army, resulting in a stalemate. His death and the succession of the weaker Undoria III led to the invasion of Ivalice and, eventually, the loss of the 50 Years' War. Now, one of the very important details which can be confusing to those who are unfamiliar with medieval history, and specifically England in the 15th century, is the relative precarity of the monarch. You see, while the king was the ruler of the kingdom, the monarchy did not have its own military arm. Standing armies weren't really a thing at this point in European history. So instead, they relied on their own retainers, the dukes and other lords, to provide the military aid required to suppress rebellions, enforce their rule, and wage wars with foreign kingdoms. Because of this, the ruling dynasty would often have familial ties to other powerful noble houses, and Ivalice was no exception. Both of the primary antagonists of the War of the Lions, Duke Druxmald Gultana, Lord of Zeltenia, and Duke Bestrald Larg, Lord of Gallion, can trace their own ancestry back to King Denamda II. Each duke also has pledged to them other powerful noble houses, like House Beolf, currently led by Dysdarg and Zalbog, and House Orlandu, led by Sidolphus. Each of these in turn command the knightly orders of the Northern and Southern Sky respectively. These military orders are the primary means by which the authority of the monarchy and the aristocracy is maintained, but the crisis of succession caused by the death of the king and the minority of Crown Prince Ornus throws the kingdom into political turmoil, as competing noble interests vie for more power. Eventually, a plot is made to kidnap and assassinate the princess, to remove her as a figure for those disaffected with Queen Luveria and Duke Larg to rally around, as she had been a viable candidate to accede to the throne. As the plot advances, it is revealed that Queen Luveria, through her brother Duke Larg, planned the plot. Duke Gultana sacks the capital city of Lazalia and captures the queen, imprisoning her in Fort Besilat. Gultana then crowns the princess as queen, but Duke Larg crowns Prince Ornus, and so begins the War of the Lions. So how is it that these families, these warrior elites, have come to dominate the kingdom of Ivalice? We have examined some of the religious justification for the stratification of Ivalice in society already, so is there a secular basis as well? The Zodiac Braves. For everyone who hasn't played the game, or for those who have, but have somehow never watched either version of the short video which plays when you load the game, the alternative title of Final Fantasy Tactics is The Zodiac Braves Story. As it happens, this is the name of the text which Ar-Islam eventually writes based on his research into the War of the Lions. The centrality of the Auracite in the narrative of the game from Chapter 2 onwards is, presumably, the basis upon which Ar-Islam chose to title his work. Among the fandom, precisely who the Zodiac Braves are supposed to be has remained enigmatic and contentious. The most obvious reading would be all of those characters who the High Confessor has provided Auracite to in order to create a new group of Zodiac Braves. Another contender would be those who use the stones to transform into Lucavi, led by the Templar Folmar of Tengil, whose mission was to revive his master, Ultima. Yet another interpretation I came across while researching this series, in the extremely dedicated and very wholesome R Final Fantasy Tactics subreddit, Redditor Wawi posted a thread on July 5, 2019 asking if Ramza plus 12 of the unique story characters would have been the real Zodiac Braves. I think all of these ideas have merit, but I'm not going to give a definitive answer, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. The myth of the Zodiac Braves, and what they represent in the history of Ivalice, is far more important than fan speculation. So while the importance of the Lucavi plot is very obvious, the question remains, why was it that the High Confessor believed that promoting a new set of Zodiac Braves would be an effective method of winning over the people in support of the Church? Now, it can be difficult to properly historicize the time we live in, within the broad sweep of history. In a period where the nation-state is the de facto manner in which countries organize themselves, where a chief function of primary and secondary public education is the inculcation of civic values and national pride into children, conceptualizing another model for state organization can be difficult. Modern nation-states have their own founding mythologies, and, depending on the so-called age of the national entity we are discussing, these can reach back into the early modern, medieval, antiquity, and even the prehistoric period. During the European Middle Ages, many of the kingdoms which would become our modern nation-states had developed or were in the process of developing their own national mythologies. From the descent from some notable figure, say Charlemagne, or group, like the Trojans, derived from folk or classical tradition, The linkages from the storied past to the present presented yet another example of Marx's justifying ideology. In many cases where the issue of ethnic homogeneity was assumed, there needed to be some further justification for the hierarchy between the productive and non-productive members of society. In many cases, chroniclers would point to some specific historic event, such as failing to answer a call to battle in defense of the fledgling nation. Those whose ancestors went into battle earned their freedom and the right to rule, whereas those whose ancestors failed the historic trial were destined for subjugation. The case of 14th century England was a bit different from many of their continental contemporaries, owing to the historic reality of the Norman conquest of the 11th century. The basis for the conquest, divine punishment for the perceived sins of the Anglo-Saxon kings, was a popular explanation in the 12th century, but by the 14th, the perception of the conquest had shifted. If we look to some of the justifications provided by the peasantry for the Great Rebellion of 1381, we can observe an appeal to an earlier period in English history, where the monarchs were more just and fair. Even, and especially, monarchs like William the Conqueror. This appeal by the rebelling peasants was predicated upon the setting of seigneurial rights following the conquest in the 11th century. Hoping to bypass the aristocratic and ecclesiastical lords who illegally inserfed their historically free tenant farmer ancestors, and appealing directly to the king. In such a fashion, the peasantry overtly acknowledged the existing hierarchy, but sought a return to a more idyllic and truly noble version of it, the justifying ideology of the ruling class, as seen from below. When we look at the story of the original Zodiac Braves critically, it is simple, but nonetheless provides everything which a foundational national myth requires. An original state of disharmony, in this case the original kingdoms of Limbury, Gallion, Fovaham, Lasalia, Zeltenia, Lionel, and Malone, were in constant and unending conflict with one another. The enterprising king of Malone began to turn the tide towards uniting the warring states, but in his efforts, he engaged in forbidden rites and summoned a demon. The king was killed, and the demon began to send its own minions across the 7 kingdoms, seeking to conquer them. A great hero emerged, and with his 12 companions, each bearing a gemstone engraved with one of the 12 zodiac signs, banding together and defeating the demon king. The heroes then disappeared once more into the ether, but the 7 kingdoms united, and the kingdom of Ivalice was born. The legend was of such significance that the cult of Saint Ajora also incorporated it into her hagiography. That she was herself a Lucavi is immaterial to the function of the myth. The recognition of the story by the authorities of the religion which arose in her name should illustrate how important the iconography of this earlier mythic period was. So who were these original Zodiac Braves? We have no way of being certain, but given their description as warriors, I would argue that rather than being random adventurers, they were the scions of the warrior elites of their age. As I illustrated earlier, the tendency for noble houses to link their ancestry to some storied historic or legendary figure to not only aggrandize their own lineage, but to justify their place in the medieval hierarchy, was practiced widely across medieval Europe. In my examination of the Glabidocian religion, I mentioned that nothing we are told about the mythology overtly expresses an ancient basis for the subjugation of the peasantry, but the game acts as if there had been. In a similar vein, it would not be unreasonable to deduce that some of the justification for the rule of the Ivalician aristocracy would have been predicated upon some link, however tenuous, to these heroic figures from the mythic past of the nation. This line of argument is not without justification, as there are at least 2 pieces of oricite with direct associations with the nobility. We learn from Elder Simon that the Virgo stone was part of the crown jewels of Ivalice, given to Orban as proof of the princess's lineage. Similarly, in the artifact's description for the Libra oricite, it is noted that the stone is a treasured heirloom of House Orlandu, and this point will become important later on. As in the case of English history discussed above, in Ivalice, the peasant-lord dichotomy was taken as a granted. The catalyst for the rebellion of the Corpse Brigade was, after all, the failure of the aristocracy to honor their duty to compensate those who fought and died for the kingdom. If even the most basic parts of the system were not functioning as they were supposed to, then perhaps it was the system itself that was to blame. The general population did not see it in such an extreme manner, of course, and that's part of the reason the rebellion failed, was a lack of popular support. But they could also look around and acknowledge that things had taken a turn for the worse. Their material existence was becoming more and more unbearable, in large part because their present was haunted by the spirits of a bygone age. A spectre is haunting Ivalice. We are first introduced to Barbaneth, patriarch of House Beolve and father to Dystarg, Zalbag, Alma, and Ramza, in a flashback which takes place 1 year prior to the opening of Chapter 1. As the narration explains, Barbaneth is the greatest statesman and warrior in the whole of the kingdom of Ivalice, achieving the highest rank possible, Knight Devout. But when we meet him, he is literally on his deathbed, moments from shuffling off this mortal coil. Despite his life fading before our very eyes, he is ever still the family patriarch, dutifully instructing his elder sons, Dystarg and Zalbag, to look after their younger half-brother, Ramza. Only beginning the melodrama which will punctuate the narrative, Ramza returns just in time to receive the following instructions. Hear me, Ramza. For generations, we Beolves have stood foremost of those who serve the crown. Ours is the soul of the knight. Become a knight worthy of your name. Tolerate no injustice. Stray not from the true path. You will know the path you must walk. A Beolve can walk no other. He's able to speak a little more, and I always found it amusing that Barbaneth swats away Ramza's hand before imparting his final words, once again. Take care of your sister, and show these brothers of yours what it is to be a knight. It's a touching scene, and it's also the first instance we get to hear Ramza's theme, which is simply titled Hero's Theme. The piece is quite fitting, soft, subtle, and tinged with a palpable sense of loss. This is the one and only time the player watches a scene with Barbaneth, but it is far from the last time his presence will be felt. The term hauntology has, over the last decade, become somewhat of an academic buzzword. Originating with Derrida in his work, Spectres of Marx, and repopularized by the works of the late Mark Fisher, there are now countless articles and books using hauntology as a conceptual framework to explore a wide variety of subjects. Hauntology itself refers to the persistence of ideas or figures from an earlier time, returning to influence and shape the present. In Derrida's text, it was the ghost of Marxism continuing to crop up in the face of neoliberal hegemony following the collapse of the USSR, and the so-called end of history. In Ivalice, however, it is not Marx, but the late Barbaneth Beolve who continues to haunt the degraded present. Throughout the game, numerous people remark about how much Ramza is the very image of his late father, in both word and deed. From our brief introduction to the character, and passing by even the defeat of Ultima, the spectre of Ramza's late father is a presence which is seemingly inescapable. And here are but a few examples. In Chapter 2, when Gefgarian is discussing what to do about Ramza turning on the Order of the Northern Sky, and Dystarg states that Ramza was a fool, Gefgarian responds with, "Too much of his father's penchant for justice, that one." There's also a telling sequence which happens just before you meet the character Beowulf Cadmus, Ramza enters a tavern in Lazalia and overhears a group discussing the infestation of a coal mine in Golland by a group of monsters. The tavern master eventually laments, "If only Lord Barbaneth were still alive, he'd do something about it." As Katie Shaw, a professor of contemporary writing, very succinctly states in her text, Hauntology, the presence of the past in 21st century English literature, the Spectre functions to highlight what has gone before us, to remind us of our responsibility to live consciously of this, and to use this knowledge to inform the future. Spectres of the past are capable of communicating in the present about the future and, in doing so, launch the possibility of a different future to come. The greatness of the past generation is woven throughout the story of Final Fantasy Tactics, everything from the decay of Ivalice following the death of the warrior king Denadma IV, and his replacement with a lesser ruler, the praise which is heaped upon House Beowulf, and the awe with which the late Barbaneth still inspired throughout the kingdom. Mechanically, this theme is heavily reinforced through the character of Sodalphus Orlandu. Anyone familiar with the game knows T.G. Cid and how game-breaking he is when you acquire him late in Chapter 4. The Sword Saint Job, unique to Orlandu, has access to all of the skills of a Holy Knight, Divine Knight, and Fell Knight. He is also able to equip all bladed weapons, heavy armor, clothes, robes, helmets, and hats. On top of this, the job has the second highest stat growth of a non-hackable character in the game. The question is why? Why is it that the developers decided to make the only character in the game who has the job of Sword Saint a graying 56-year-old man who also happened to be best buds with Ramza's dad? It's because the Greatest Generation had to show it still had something left to give, to prove that the glorious past was not wholly spent, and inspire the next generation to aspire to greatness. Barbaneth did die, and as befitting a master swordsman, not by being felled by a superior opponent on the battlefield, but by the patricidal machinations of his own son. Orlandu, on the other hand, sworn as he was to serve his liege lord, Duke Gultana, was freed from his commitment owing to Gultana's failure to heed his own counsel, the counsel of his most loyal retainer, and choosing instead the deceits of Delita and the High Confessor. It is narratively significant that of all the characters we encounter, it is T.G. Cid alone who possesses a piece of Orosite which was not recently found or given to him by the High Confessor. As I've already discussed, the Virgo and Libra stones are as close as a direct link we can find tracing the nobility back to the original Zodiac Braves. It is also thematically significant because of what Orlandu represents, which is where we turn our attention to next. Chivalry of a Failed Knight. Chivalry is mentioned a total of 2 times within the entire script of the game. The first time is when Gafgarion mocks the deference Agrias expects to be shown in the presence of the princess during the opening dialogue of the game. The second time is the brief description of the knight's job. Otherwise, the term is wholly absent from the narrative. Instead, its significance is heavily inferred through the game, and it is difficult to talk about the ideology of the ruling class of medieval Europe without taking it into consideration. The concept of chivalry, an amalgam of behavioral precepts of the European warrior elite distilled by varying degrees into historic codices, is much more complex than popular discourse may reveal. There is a vast litany of primary sources as well as secondary texts dedicated to the exploration of chivalry, and as I have already done with Bushido, I fully intend on making a more in-depth video on the topic at some future point. According to medievalist and fellow HEMA enthusiast Ked Monsheen, a concise and helpful definition of chivalry is: the self-conception of the medieval ruling elite was that of the professional warrior. Chivalry, combining the ideas of militia, a military service, chivalry, the physical skills, notably horsemanship, and courtesy, an aristocratic way of life, was the code by means of which members of the elite related to one another. Agrius Oaks, member of the Lion's Guard, the knightly order dedicated to protecting the Ivalicean royal family, is one of the first characters we meet and has long been a fan favorite. She certainly is mine. She is also one of the characters who is of the current generation who still holds to the maintenance of deference to the receding dynasty of the Atkachas, as expressed by this exchange between her and Gafgarian following his apparent betrayal. "Have you any idea what you do? The path you tread leads only to perdition. An adopted daughter she may be, but a daughter of kings no less. To lay a finger on her is treason. Of that I am well aware, but your daughter of kings stands in the way of kings to be. Princess or no, her worth is spent, and those born of kings do not outlive their worth." "Do you mean to mock her?" "No more than we are mocked. Have you once seen a man of royal blood stay his hand when a commoner blocked his way? The only difference is that those of royal blood are protected by lackwits like you, who swear fealty without even a thought. Even should the princess live, it would be only as a pawn in another's game. To kill her now is a mercy. Then it is a mercy I will not see her done." While Gafgarian's words cut deep, they are nevertheless true. The entire edifice of the Ivalicean nobility is built upon a latticework of loyal and dedicated retainers whose own material interest benefits from the maintenance of this relationship. You see, the crown grants the noble houses land rights, trade deals, revenue from taxation, and judicial authority to govern their respective duchies in the king's name. The monarchy in turn receives the martial support of the nobility, who have exclusive rights to the use of illicit violence. So long as it was a mutually beneficial arrangement, there was a modicum of order maintained to suppress and exploit the productive members of medieval society, the peasantry. This was done through force, or, to speak in terms of chivalric virtues, prowess. In terms of the romantic imagery associated with the concept of chivalry as the lofty ideal of proper aristocratic behavior, the historic reality was much simpler. The raw application of martial force trumped other considerations. Prowess, that is, efficacy in combat and warfare in general, lay at the heart of chivalric idealism. The nobility in medieval Europe was descended from an earlier warrior elite, and this became enshrined by law and custom throughout the Middle Ages. Chivalry as a justifying ideology, then, provided as much of a legitimation of the nobility as did religious arguments. The connection with some past figure or event where the quality of their ancestors was tested, coupled with their current ability to use illicit violence to enforce their rulership, justified their place in the medieval hierarchy and feudal system of production. While the nobility had an obligation to fight on behalf of the peasantry, this was much more idealism than historic reality. Peasant rebellions were crushed with as much force as was necessary to return to the status quo as quickly as possible. Final Fantasy Tactics certainly leans into and makes effective use of the idea of prowess, complementing my assertion from the earlier video on the centrality of power and the Glabadocian religion, and this is nowhere more apparent than the Holy Knight. For those unfamiliar with the game, the Holy Knight's command skill, Holy Sword, allows the user to attack at close, mid, and long range, with physical attacks dealing out considerable damage, something not available to the generic player character without significant grinding. There are 3 characters in the game who have the job of Holy Knight: Ygraf, Agrius, and Delita. While Ygraf is the one to buck the trend of being affiliated with the nobility, his role as commander of the Dead Men, and then Corpse Brigade, mark him as a powerful warrior. Agrius' membership in the Lion's Guard, a knightly order who functions as the bodyguards of the royal family, explains her abilities. Delita, also not of a noble house, but brought into the fold of both the Church, the Black Ram Knights, and finally, the Order of the Southern Sky, again provides narrative justification for access to the Holy Knight job skills. Ramza, in case it isn't already obvious, is our titular failed knight. Despite his coming from one of the most storied and ancient of warrior houses in Ivalice, despite his personal commitment to chivalric virtues like justice, and despite his own personal prowess on the battlefield, he is never able to ascend to the rank of a holy knight. The reason is as simple as anything: he is never dubbed a knight by any member of a knightly order, or a royal with the ability to do so. This effectively bars him from ever advancing any further than the rank of squire, and while his uber squire job is very good, he never gains access to any of the sword skills used by other special player and enemy units. I've mentioned it before, but certainly the mechanical justification for not allowing Ramza to access Holy Knight job skills is to maintain a party balance, and to also make the acquisition of Orlandu all the more significant. As I have maintained throughout, Final Fantasy Tactics' true brilliance is in its ability to so deftly weave together the narrative with the mechanical for a more cohesive gaming experience. By maintaining the only rank he was able to achieve, that of a squire, it reinforces the fact that Ramza has indeed forsworn his entitlements and hereditary rights. Nevertheless, or perhaps in spite of it, Ramza is able to keep the promise he made to his father to walk the path of a true knight. It also undergirds a surprising historic fact that, on average, the male lines of noble houses tended to last no more than 3 generations. So while it does not neatly fit into the periodization of the English Wars of the Roses, Ivalice is very much a kingdom which faces an unparalleled crisis, and by the end of the game, the kingdom of Ivalice emerges as a very different place from when we began. The Crisis of Feudalism. There is a popular and long-standing historiographical perspective that the 14th century, the tail end of the late Middle Ages, can be characterized as being a period of crisis of varying degrees, largely dependent on how you define crisis. The reasons are multifaceted. A general stagnation in productive output, which was not able to keep up with demands of the non-producing classes. Widespread famine caused by the so-called Little Ice Age. The advent of the Black Plague. The Western Schism in the Catholic Church. Peasant rebellions, and prolonged international war. All of these factors brought about an end to the stability of the preceding medieval period, and Europe would not begin to fully recover until the beginning of the 16th century. Now, the situation in Ivalice was a little different, and the crisis was characterized by the decline of the legitimacy of the rule of the nobility and the ascendancy of the church. Now, I've already talked at length about the general spirit of stagnation and longing for a more stable and prosperous past which permeated the age of the War of the Lions, so it need not be repeated here. One of the subtle narrative elements which can be easy to lose amidst the demonic scheming and grinding to finally get your Dark Knight is the nod the devs gave to the rise of the bourgeoisie through the character of Grand Duke Barrington. Gareth Barrington, Liege Lord of Fovaham, is a member of the nobility, but does not come from a warrior house. As such, he did not personally fight in the 50 Years' War, but hired out his mercenary assassins instead. Barrington represents those who, lacking the proper noble pedigree, seek to use their financial resources to gain entry into the higher echelons of Ivalicean society. This threat from below was the impetus for many laws and legislative actions to further codify a rigid class distinction, in medieval England anyway. If he wasn't such a reprehensible character, you might almost feel sorry for him being a century or two early to properly institute the bourgeoisie overturning of the aristocracy. Oh well. Bye, Barrington. The political crisis in Ivalice comes to a head with the outbreak of the War of the Lions, and the size of the armies being fielded are truly staggering. When you examine historic documentation from some of the more famous battles which occurred during the Wars of the Roses, they are certainly not small affairs. Take, for example, the Battle of Towton, which was fought on March 29, 1461. It was the largest and bloodiest of all the battles fought during the Wars of the Roses, and possibly to have ever been fought on English soil. While the claim of troop strength reaching some 76,000 is a gross exaggeration, the number was nevertheless in the tens of thousands. Contrast this with a council held by Duke Galtana 3 months into the war. We are told the death toll from the last engagement from both sides was 20,040, and the Order of the Southern Sky suffered some 200,000 wounded. Those are absolutely staggering numbers. To put it into perspective, the estimated total casualties for the entire period of the Wars of the Roses, something that spanned 32 years, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000. However, despite the massive difference in population, the effects of the conflict were not terribly dissimilar. If we turn back to look at the exchange where we hear our casualties, we can also observe the justifications provided by those in the Council of Galtana. It is of course the peasantry which suffer the worst of the fallout from the conflict: drought, famine, and higher taxation. Galtana and most of the council dismiss such concerns as irrelevant compared to the justness of their own cause to place the princess on the throne. Orlando alone is presented as the voice of the peasantry, trying, and ultimately failing, to convince his lord to negotiate peace with Duke Larg. We would expect nothing less from the avatar of the Old Order, but it is worth noting that Orlando is forced to concede and abandons this line of argument. His loyalty to the Duke is stronger than his concern for the common folk of Ivalice. Despite the game reminding us at every opportunity that Orlando and the late Barboneth are the avatars of the chivalric virtue of largesse, the reality at the end of the day is that even these stalwart nobles were nobles. Regardless of their own individual commitment to the ideals of justice, they will fulfill their sworn duty to their lords and use all that they can to crush their enemies. When largesse runs up against prowess, prowess wins every time. Orlando, as I mentioned earlier, is ultimately forced to break his sworn oath, but given a narrative out to maintain his own honor. Nevertheless, history would record Orlando being executed for plotting treason and murdering Duke Galtana, and House Orlando effectively came to an end. This would hardly be the last noble house to fall, because by the end of the game, most of the noble houses are no more. House Beowulf, Orlando, Galtana, Larg, and as it is eventually revealed, even the royal house of Atkacha are all brought to an ignominious end. This does reflect a stark historic reality as well. While it did not lead to the same catastrophic end of the ruling houses of England, by the end of the Wars of the Roses, a quarter of the noble houses had been wiped out. Despite the plot of Fulmarv and the Lucavi being thwarted by Ramza and the murder of High Confessor Funebris, the Church of Glabados emerges from the conflict more powerful than it had been for decades. The Church, as it turns out, was the real victor in all of this. While their plan to establish a new set of Zodiac Braves failed, the end of the major noble houses and the ascension of Delita to the Throne of Ivalice gave them a powerful ally. Delita proclaims throughout his interactions with Ramza that he is himself using the church to achieve his own ambition. But when you consider the fate of Oren, this becomes at best questionable, and more likely, simple deception. For those of you who aren't aware, Oren is the adopted son of Orlando. Oren, for all we know, remains in the service of the new king and queen, but is still imprisoned by the church and burned at the stake as a heretic. If Delita had the desire or ability to intervene, surely he could have done so. Instead, what we are left with is the foundation for a new way forward for Ivalice. The aristocracy, a corrupt and decaying institution, has been left in shambles. The Church of Glabados has been restored to a more ascendant and central role in the kingdom. The devastation wrought by the War of the Lions has been ended, and peace has been brought to the common people once again. In the person of King Delita Hyrule, we have a final amalgamation of the three medieval orders: the chivalric knight of the aristocracy, the savior of the church, and a common-born champion of the people. It is straight out of medieval romance. It is pure ideology. It is a lie. Afterward. There was a lot to unpack in this one, so I'm hoping that everything was clear enough to get the main points across. This video was originally going to really lean heavily into the status of Final Fantasy Tactics as one of the most political entries in the franchise, but I ultimately decided at that point was really ancillary to the more thorough exploration of the aristocracy of Ivalice and how politics reinforces the dominant mode of production. Rest assured that I'm not going to waste what I think is a very interesting thread, and it will almost certainly be appearing in that miscellany video I mentioned previously. Let me know what you think, and if there are any other threads from this or earlier videos in this series you'd like to see expanded a bit more, let me know. I also wanted to acknowledge an incredibly useful source I've been relying on but failed to include in my source lists in 2 previous videos, which I have since remedied. The Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions game script, written and transcribed by Kyle Johnston and hosted on the Game FAQ's website, has been an invaluable means of easily cross-referencing text, saving me from having to slog through all of the recorded video to locate information. Thanks for the hard work and dedication to this game. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and think it is merited, please give it a like. If you did not, please show your displeasure by giving it a dislike. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I always post my sources in the episode notes, so if you want to follow up with your own reading, it's a good place to start. If you think anyone else you may know would enjoy this video, please share it. I'm sure you're aware of the grind that is YouTube, and any engagement really does help out a lot. As always, if you like what I do and want to be updated when new content is published, subscribe to the channel. There should also be some links to other videos I've made coming up shortly. Thanks for your time.